In this video, I'd like to talk about the Presocratic philosophers. I have some notes that I'd like to expand on a little bit and share with you. This is a follow-up to the last video that we did, where we just sort of explored what philosophy is. What is philosophy? And in that last video, we proposed a couple of different general definitions that try and characterize the activity of philosophy. At the close of that presentation, we did raise the distinction between philosophy as a tradition, which we can say starts with the Presocratics and extends through to today. That's one sense of philosophy. From another point of view, you can say philosophy is an activity that we can engage in as human beings with one another, or even just by ourselves, a kind of questioning of things, questioning of what's true. So considering the beginnings, and this video is an exploration of the beginnings of the tradition. And you could ask, well, why did philosophy begin at this particular time in history? And just like you could ask, how did philosophy get started for a particular individual? I'm saying, true philosophy, anyhow, truly thinking and questioning what's true. What leads up to that, or what set of circumstances or life experiences makes it possible? So there's probably a parallel between the beginnings, the Presocratics, and the beginnings for us as individuals. Primarily, in this case, we're just going to look at how it got started for the Presocratics. It's a pretty interesting story and a pretty interesting group of individuals.
Here's a map of the ancient world around the time when the Presocratics appeared, and we're looking at the Mediterranean. In the center is this is the northern coast of the Mediterranean. In the center is Greece. On our left is Italy. On the right is what we would call modern day Turkey. So in around the 6th and 5th century BCE is when these philosophers that we're going to take a look at, when they appeared, and they seem to have a different kind of interest than people had previously. That's an interesting question, why philosophy should begin at this particular time in history. It's if we think that before this period philosophy didn't exist, so something has to happen which facilitates this beginning. And I'm not sure we can answer that entirely, but there are a few things we could say about life in ancient Greece at this time. First of all, we can point out that at this point in history, the Greeks were doing pretty well. They were prosperous. They made their living on the sea. And prosperity, or the accumulation of wealth, you might say, is a kind of precondition for people having time, to sit down and think about things. And if you spend all your time trying to meet your basic needs, it doesn't seem like you would have much time to do philosophy. So the Greeks were prosperous, and that helped. Secondly, their occupation on the sea. They engaged in trade with other cities around the Mediterranean, exposed them to different cultures, different ideas and values that other peoples had. And this exposure to differences also seems to be necessary in order to start asking questions about, well, who's got the best ideas, or who's got the right values to have. If we live in a monolithic society where everybody thinks the same thing, it's a little harder to imagine people starting to ask questions about it. So it's only when we're exposed to different points of view that these questions start to appear. The last point I have listed here is that probably the most important is that at this time period, you could say that people have always had these questions about life and the world that they live in and so forth. But at this time period, there was some dissatisfaction with the kinds of answers that people were getting, some disappointment in what the traditional answers to the basic questions about the world were. And we could say that those traditional answers came from either mythology or religion. You could say for the Greeks had an elaborate mythology, and they also had religious beliefs that were kind of derived from their mythologies. And those mythologies, you could say, what was the origin of the myths? And we say they came from the poets, like in the Greek case from Homer, and we arguably from the human imagination. So at this point in history, some of the Greeks were no longer satisfied with those kinds of explanations. I mean, they wanted something more. So this turn to the world itself in order to explain the world led to the proposal of theories about what things were and how they behaved, and so different thinkers would propose theories, but it wasn't accepted that just because you proposed a theory, people should accept it. So there had to be explanations, or you had to justify your theory, or you had to argue for it. And then you could say that the person who had the best explanations for why things were the way that they were, or had the best arguments, was the one who that you should listen to more. These first philosophers, the Presocratics, that we're going to take a look at, I mean, you wouldn't say that they were interested in the complete range of philosophical questions. They had a certain number of interests that they pursued, and certain types of questions that they tended to ask. Primarily, they were interested in the world of nature, trying to explain the natural world. Nature in Greek was physis, or I think more properly physis, you would say, and that's clearly the root for what we call physics today. So the first philosophers were really doing something like natural philosophy, the philosophy of nature. And you can see right away that this beginning of philosophy is also the beginning of a scientific way of trying to understand the world as well. So in the beginning, philosophy and science are kind of the same thing. So some of the basic questions that a lot of the philosophers were interested in is, what's the basic stuff out of which everything is made. I mean, so what's the basis of everything that we experience? It's kind of like asking about elements, but that term isn't quite uh, used yet, so it's like, what's everything made out of? And so that's one thing. And the other question was, how do you account for change? The fact that everything always seems to be changing. If you want to give an explanation for what people experience about reality, you could say, how do you explain the fact that things come into existence and then go out of existence, or things become alive and then they eventually they die? How do you explain generation and decay? So these were some of the fundamental questions that the philosophers kind of gravitated towards, the first philosophers anyhow. So for these new kinds of answers, or people began to turn away from just what had always been traditionally accepted, or what it seemed like came from the imagination. People turned away from that towards another way of trying to explain the world. You'd say that was they they looked at the world in terms of what they could actually have experiences of, what direct observation of reality told them, combined with uh, thinking about what those observations were. So you get direct observations and reasoning about things. And these two basic approaches uh, give philosophy two different ways of thinking about the world that will develop and become pretty distinct as time goes on. The first one we're just going to call empiricism. You could have an empirical approach to the world in which there's more emphasis is given to actually having experiences, or having seen things for yourself, observations. And so primary reliance on experience and observation gives you an empirical approach. The other approach gives more emphasis to the thoughts that are needed to think about what we experience. So you say that's rationalism. And here the emphasis is more on the rules of thought, rational principles, logical thinking, and stuff like that. So you get two distinct kinds of philosophy gradually begin to appear. The philosopher who is usually given credit for being the first philosopher, or the father of philosophy, so to speak, is Thales. And he lived in Miletus, which was on the eastern shores of the Aegean, which would be in modern day Turkey. And he sort of had a theory that the basic substance out of which everything else could be derived was water. So you say that kind of position is monism, to feel that there's only one basic substance and everything else is somehow derived from that substance. That's, you call that monist theory. So Thales had his argument, and he could argue that water is capable of, existing in different states. It could become steam, or it can become ice, so it could be exist in different physical states. And he would have his arguments to try and explain everything. I mean, we don't have so much information about what his theories actually were. But, we shouldn't be so quick to think that he was simple-minded, because he's apparently was capable of predicting eclipses and sort of determining when was a good time to buy into the wine press industry. So he made a lot of money by being able to see how things were going to go. But anyhow, I mean, and he, as it happens in philosophy, I mean, he had some followers who were interested in his ideas. Two of them in particular. First one was Anaximander, and is typical in philosophy that the students don't necessarily just accept what the teacher has to say, but they question it and want to try and improve it. And so Anaximander did that, I mean, to his teacher's theories. Anaximander proposed that the basic substance out of which everything else is supposed to come has to be something which is indeterminate in itself and boundless in its limitations. So he calls this the apeiron. So, which is something which is indeterminate and boundless. I'm going to say that the basic substance has to be something that could become anything, and there has to be an unlimited quantity of it. So that was Anaximander thinking about what, if you want to look for a source material and say that everything comes from that it would have to be something with these kinds of characteristics. The second pupil of Thales was Anaximenes. And you can see that Anaximenes tries to come up with a compromise position between Thales and Anaximander. So you could say that Anaximander's apeiron seems too ethereal to be the basis of everything, and Thales' water is too definite. So Anaximenes wants to propose something in between, something which is too ethereal and something which is too concrete. So he proposes air as the basis element out of which everything else is somehow derived. You see, all three of them are monist philosophers. They all want to argue a case for a single element which is primary, and everything's derived from it. As a group, these philosophers were known as the Milesians, and we're not all that interested in what their specific arguments were. We're more interested in what they were trying to do and sort of in how they were trying to go about it than in the actual content of their thought. They were trying to give their own explanations. They gave arguments for their positions, and they criticized each other as they went forward, trying to get at what they thought was the best explanation. The second of the Presocratic philosophers we wanted to look a little more closely at is Pythagoras. And his theories are certainly a bit more interesting than those of the Milesian philosophers. Pythagoras is kind of well known to us. I mean, so the Pythagorean theorem, this theorem relating to right-angled triangles, x squared plus y squared equals z squared, is known in geometry to most people. So, but Pythagoras had believed that mathematics was the key to everything. So for him, the basic elements out of which everything else was derived were numbers. And how he thought of numbers is a bit of a question. I mean, whether he was talking about numbers or numerical relationships as the way to think about reality is a little unclear, but the study of numbers, mathematics, geometry, and so forth were very much emphasized in his way of trying to understand reality. Numbers were the basic substances. out of which everything is composed. And for him, numbers weren't abstractions, they were actually existing things, not something that just exists in the mind. And Pythagoras had a lot of followers, and people referred to as Pythagoreans, and they developed communities that they lived in, sort of separate from other people, and they had a program of study for the people who lived in these communities. And three subjects I've identified were central. The first was the study of mathematics and geometry. So again, a kind of primary study of numbers and the interrelationships between numbers. We say one number in a relationship to another number is a ratio. And you should remind ourselves that ratio, ratio, is the root word for our word rational. So there's still this sense that rational order has something is based on kind of relationships like this. So there's a lot of interest in ratios and proportions in the study of mathematics and geometry. Geometry in particular was looked at as the divine discipline, more, privileged over all other studies. And it was, if you thought that reality was numerical and that there was a divinity in reality, then the study of numbers was a way of understanding the divinity or becoming closer to God. Music was another area where mathematics was involved and studied. The Pythagoreans developed musical scales and harmonics. And some of their neighbors referred to them as string pluckers because they were always experimenting with the sounds that you could get from stretching strings and getting different notes and so forth from them. Even this idea that there was a kind of rational order in music and involving, just like music could be looked at mathematically, meant that there was a relationship between music and sort of everything else. And the Pythagoreans had this notion of the music of the spheres, and that even the whole of reality was had a kind of musicality to it, and or that there was the harmony of the spheres, the harmony of the world was musical as well as it was geometrical and mathematical. So when you're understanding sort of the world that we live in, and you feel it's not chaotic but in accordance with certain laws and principles, Pythagoreans thought that was the study of numbers and music combined. They also studied medicine and more so health, the health of the human organism, the human being, and the idea that health was a kind of established balance and proportion within the body, and again, which was a balance and a proportion that could be mathematically expressed. Disease or illness were conceived as disturbances of this internal balance. So you try to correct things, put things back in their proper order. So they were interested in the health of the body. They were also interested in the health of the soul. And maybe the aim of the program of study in these Pythagorean communities was the purification of the soul. That this understanding of mathematics, geometry, music, and medicine was all kind of a way of purifying the soul and allowing for it to see things more clearly. I don't know what would happen if one achieved the ultimate in this case. They did believe in reincarnation, and not endless reincarnation, but that a particular soul could go through a number of lifetimes of a human being. But at a certain point when a person would die, the soul would die too. So this is a more interesting teaching, and it has a long, influential history as well. But we'll try and see how that gets picked up later.
Heraclitus is the third pre-Socratic philosopher we'd like to comment on. Like Pythagoras, his ideas, his thinking is interesting, and he has an influence that reaches far beyond the time of the pre-Socratic philosophers. We can say that later his ideas show up with Stoic philosophers, more closer to even the modern era. You can find the thinkers like Nietzsche, Hegel, Heidegger, all write about Heraclitus in a positive vein, where there's something they see in his philosophy that they still think is interesting to consider. It's a little peculiar because the information that we have about Heraclitus, like most of the pre-Socratic philosophers, is pretty thin. I mean, not a lot of direct source material to rely on. In the case of Heraclitus, there's a collection of basically sayings or kind of short, kind of almost cryptic statements about things that are all that remains of what he had to say. And although I think Nietzsche, who was a pretty good classical scholar, sort of argued that there was a more extensive collection of writings from Heraclitus, but this is all that remains for us. And I think if we look at it, I think there's almost 100 sayings, but nowhere is it sort of developed into a coherent presentation of what his thought was. So you kind of have to interpret his statements, and in spite of the difficulty, the tradition seems to indicate that there's a kind of consensus as to what the general drift of his philosophy was. One of the statements that he gives us is one that's pretty well known. You cannot step in the same river twice. Now, how are we supposed to understand? What's the meaning for that? Again, it's not explained, but clearly it looks like he's emphasizing. Well, you ask, why can't you step in the same river twice? And because the water is always flowing, and wherever you step in the river, the water that you're stepping into is water that wasn't there previously. So you could say the nature of the river is always changing. And so we can't take what he has to say literally. You kind of have to understand sayings like this metaphorically. And he seems to be emphasizing that nature is always changing, or he makes statements that all is in flux. We want to say that we want to keep in mind that he also emphasizes that there's something which underlies all the change, which doesn't change. I will explain as we go along. So you can't step in the same river twice. We take it metaphorically. And he's talking about reality. In some sense, reality is like a river. You could say, even within ourselves, in human reality, that within our own consciousness, we say there's a stream of consciousness or a flow of thoughts, which is almost nonstop. And in a sense, if you look inside yourself, you can never step in the same river twice because your thought processes are always developing, always changing. But then again, at the same time, you can say that they're still always your thoughts, you know. And so there's something unitary beneath, in the midst of all the change or behind all the change. Just like in the river, the water is always flowing, but still it's the same river. So it's kind of it's like a paradox. There's change and that which doesn't change together. And that reality is like this, that there's an aspect of reality that's constantly changing, but nevertheless, there's also some kind of underlying something which stays the same. Yeah, Heraclitus, like his predecessors, identifies an element that he thinks is the best one to use to talk about reality, and for him, it's fire as the basic element. And again, the only way to understand this is metaphorically. And it's if you look at it, I mean, metaphorically, it's kind of a rich line of thought. So you could say fire, kind of, in his view, best represents the changing nature of reality. So everything that exists is constantly being transformed. If you think about a piece of wood that burns, uh, while it's burning, there's flame, there's heat, there's smoke, and in the end, there's ashes. So you would say it's not like the wood has entirely been destroyed, but what it has been is it's been transformed into these other things, the heat, the flame, the smoke, and ash, and so forth. And you say, so it's become something different than what it was. And you could say that reality, that's what's happening in reality, that reality is constantly being transformed, that there's change taking place in reality all the time. And not like reality, things in reality are destroyed, but they just take new forms. So it's kind of just like an equal measure of what goes in and what comes out. It's kind of like conservation of energy. So you got that, and then Heraclitus also uses this term, logos, Greek term, uh, to indicate that which is always the same in the midst of all the change. And like in Pythagoras, I think logos refers to a kind of order that exists beneath the ongoing change, a kind of, and I think we could say it's a kind of rational order. Uh, so you can say you can't step in the same river twice. Everything's always flowing, but there's sort of a structure or an underlying aspect to things, which is the kind of laws that are in place that govern how things change. And logos is a way of referring to that. I think it's interesting. There's a fire in a way. You could say that there's this logos, and that there's fire also represents a spark of. You could say there's a spark of the fire. There's a spark of the order that exists in nature within ourselves. A kind of spark of life, a spark of reason. And ultimately, later, I don't think Heraclitus says this, but subsequent thinkers will, that there's a spark of the divine in each of us that enables us to understand, to live, and to understand.
Well, the fourth specific philosopher we want to comment on amongst Presocratics is Parmenides. And Parmenides in particular invites contrast with the philosophy of Heraclitus. And we'll make use of that in our next slide a little bit. But Heraclitus argued that reality is constantly changing. And Parmenides is going to argue just the opposite. He's going to say that nothing which is real changes. So then that the reality of change, or that what appears to be change, is just an illusion on his view. So, Parmenides argues a point of view that is kind of hard to acknowledge, like where it comes from, and how is that possible to deny the existence of change when if we just look around, it looks to us like everything's always changing. But if we look at Parmenides, we see that he argues on the basis of certain, what we call a priori principles of reason. And in this regard, he's going to be an example of rationalism, somebody who gives more significance to what the mind tells us about reality and what our senses tell us about reality. Two arguments in particular that Parmenides makes is excuse me, is that a thing cannot both be and not be at the same time and in the same respect. Something either is or it is not, and there's no in-between state between those two. So you'd say that's the principle of non-contradiction. Both a thing can't both be and not be at the same time. That seems obvious. Okay, that's true. And you say that's a kind of a priori principle. The second thing he argues is that it's impossible for something to come from nothing. So again, if you don't have anything to start with, there's no way that you can get anything from it. So that's another principle, kind of a priori logical principle that Parmenides wants to focus on. A principle that kind of the mind tells us that, that if you don't have something to start with, you can't get anything from it. Now that's an interesting argument, and for the Greeks, that was a principle that was really pretty much adhered to, and this sort of, if you extend it a little bit, you can see that that means, as it does for Parmenides, that whatever exist has to always have existed, and that there could never have been a time when there was nothing. Because if ever there was a time when there was nothing, then there would still be nothing. I mean, because there'd be no way to get something that came out of nothing. The one religious argument that the Greeks would have had a hard time with is the one in Christianity, where Augustine says that God created everything out of nothing. So that this Christian doctrine that there was nothing and then God brought reality into existence. That would have been an idea that was difficult for the Greeks to accept, because for them there had to be something which always existed. So the conclusions that Parmenides will draw from these kinds of arguments, if a thing has to either be or not be, and it's impossible to get something from nothing, then he's going to conclude that whatever is has to always have been. And change technically is impossible, because when something changes, it goes from being one thing to being something else, and that, in accordance with his principle, is not something that could happen. It's like going from something which is not to something which is, or back and forth. So for him, being is something which is unitary, changeless, eternal, and one. It's not quite what we would think of as God, but maybe in some sense there's something to be said for that. This is a difficult intellectual position, and logically it's hard to argue with what he had to say, but it also seems to contradict what our ordinary experience of reality is. As I said before, we can use the philosophies of Heraclitus and then of Parmenides as illustrations of the difference between empiricism and rationalism. Maybe it's a misuse of Heraclitus, because in a sense for him there are some things that don't change, but in general the central principle in Heraclitus is everything is always changing, and our sense experience kind of verifies that, just without any kind of question. So that's kind of obvious. And so he's an empiricist, or his position seems to be empirical. Parmenides, on the other hand, is clearly a good example of a rationalist, or somebody who doesn't trust what the senses tell them about reality, but would rather trust his thoughts, the principles of thoughts in a way. So that's typical of rationalists, is that they give precedence to what the mind tells them is real, more so than what the body tells them is real. So we'll set that aside. One other philosopher I just want to comment on, maybe it's a little simplistic, but you can see Empedocles wants to try to synthesize the positions of Heraclitus and Parmenides. You have these two opposing positions, one which emphasizes change, the other emphasizes a sense in which everything's the same. So Empedocles is trying to find a way to have both of these be true, and he does this by arguing that there are basic elements, and for him he just identifies four of them: earth, air, fire, and water. And you could say these elements are constants. The elements themselves don't change, but they can enter into different combinations and give us different kinds of things. So the elements themselves don't change. So that is kind of like Parmenides. On the other hand, he also argues that there are two forces that work on these basic elements, earth, air, fire, and water. And these forces that are what sort of account for the changes that we actually experience. He says one force has to be something like love, which unites things, brings them together, accounts for creation and growth. And then a contrary force which separates things and accounts for decay and death. So you have so now we're talking about basic elements and sort of basic forces in nature. So that seems to be a kind of advance. It still seems a little simplistic, but the ideas are another step in trying to explain what stays the same and what changes in our experience of reality. Okay, our last slide in this presentation, which has proved to be longer than anticipated. And here on this last page, again, there's another contrast, which is, philosophically interesting, I think. So we're going to give more time to the second group of thinkers, the atomists, than Anaxagoras. But Anaxagoras was, we're not giving him a lot of time, but was a significant contributor among the Presocratic philosophers as well. So we're just looking at his kind of main idea, and Anaxagoras introduced the idea of nous, the Greek term, which was a way of referring to maybe like universal mind, or a kind of rational governing principle in nature, and that for Anaxagoras there had to be something like an intelligence that made everything be the way that it is. And for him, the intelligence had to be something other than material. So something like a universal mind that sort of was responsible for the order that we observe in nature. So mind is different from matter. And in his view, mind is what first sets matter in motion. So for him, you couldn't have a strictly materialistic explanation of the world of human experience. That a material explanation couldn't account for it all. So we'll leave it at that for now. Now, in contradistinction to this, the atomist, the most prominent of which was Democritus, argued a case to the contrary, and that's a case for materialism. How they came up with this theory, the atomist, is kind of left open, so how could they, this is the world, a time before there's any kind of, microscope and so forth to see what's going on in kind of the invisible aspect of things. But the atomist argued that tiny, invisible, or invisible to the naked eye anyhow, atoms are the basic stuff out of which everything else is composed. So atoms were tiny particles, indestructible in themselves, but were the basis of everything that we know to be in existence. These atoms, according to the theory, moved randomly sort of through space. I mean, they kind of fell or falling in a way, but not like other things fall. Maybe they floated in space. And they were governed by a kind of random, or there's no, doesn't seem to be anything in particular, no order in terms of how they fall. These atoms were supposedly differently shaped, and because they were differently shaped, they were capable of combining with one another. They would occasionally bump into each other, and they might become connected as a result of this bumping in, or else they might just bounce off. But and these atoms were supposedly separated from each other by kind of void spaces, so they just kind of floated around and, in some extent, fell. The term used for their motion was Kleinemann. So, according to the atomist, everything that exists was the result of these kinds of actions, these kinds of random movements and combinations and so forth. So there was no sense that there was a purpose or a design involved in how things happen. It doesn't mean that everything was accidental. I mean, because there were rules or laws that governed when things would get connected and so forth. But it was kind of denied that there was any kind of plan in how things evolved as a result of this kind of process. And really, how they came to this is not entirely clear, but it certainly looks like a precursor to modern sort of evolutionary type theories, and especially a theory in which there was no attempt to justify things in terms of a divinity or a god or an intelligence that sort of guided how things happen. So you have this contrast with the arguments of Anaxagoras and the arguments of the atomist, one of which insists that there has to be a kind of intelligence in the design of everything, and the other which says that there is no universal mind. Now, if you're an atomist, and a strict materialist, there's consequences that go with that kind of theory. I mean, that sort of are challenging sort of to deal with. But nonetheless, that's what it is. I'll just say in conclusion to this longer than expected presentation that there's no definite right or wrong in any of these theories, and you could say that they certainly didn't agree with each other, and there was a lot of different points of view explored. And it looks like that's just what it is amongst the Presocratics. It was an exploration of the possibilities in terms of how can we explain, the reality that we know and live in, and these are just some of the possibilities.